Good morning and welcome to our webinar titled Apprenticeship Funding Rules version 6 Changes. Thank you for joining us. Before I introduce our speaker, I'd like to explain a few things about our webinar platform to allow you to get the most out of the experience. All viewers will be in listen-only mode. However, to engage with the webinar, please use the on-screen panel. You can also adjust your audio settings using the tabs on this panel. Feel free to use the question tab to engage with us during the webinar. We expect that our webinar will be extremely popular, but our team will do their best to answer your questions at the end. After the webinar, we will be providing a recording, a copy of the slides, and a Q&A to address any unanswered questions. Now I'd like to hand over to our presenter, Bryony Kingsland, UK Funding Officer.
Good morning everybody and welcome to the webinar. Thanks for joining us today. So, as you all know, at the end of March, the ESFA published version 6 of the Apprenticeship Funding and Performance Management Rules for providers, for employer providers, and also for employers. So, what I've done over the course of the last couple of weeks is look very carefully at both the old document and the new document and compare where the changes have occurred. I've also looked at a couple of other documents that the ESFA published at the same time that some of you may or may not be aware of. So if we just get that slide to move on. Great. So as you can see these are the funding documents that the government published in late March, early April. So they published version 6 of the Apprenticeship Funding and Performance Management Rules. They also published at the same time a summary of changes. Unfortunately, with that summary of changes, they didn't actually put in the introduction on that first page that they had published the summary of changes for version 6. You can't see on that summary of changes document that version 6 is included, but it is actually in there. So that was a little bit unhelpful, but we are where we are. So for those of you who want to go in and check changes without having to go through everything, you can look at that summary of changes document. And version 6 changes are in there. They also published at the same time a policy and background document about using subcontractors in the delivery of apprenticeships. So some of the information in this webinar is going to look at what that document is saying about subcontracting. So one more thing to mention, the current version 6 of the Apprenticeship Funding and Performance Management Rules only runs until 31st of July of this year. The ESFA has stated that they will be publishing a new set of rules for 2018-19. We can expect some further changes to the funding rules in the new set of funding rules whenever they become published for next year's apprenticeship delivery. One of the things I think we can expect that everybody may or may not be aware of is that there probably will be some changes to the funding bands. We are expecting there to be more funding bands for 2018-19 delivery year. And potentially other changes to funding rules, and particularly as well, we think more information and more clarification on use of subcontractors in the delivery of apprenticeships, over and above the policy and background and examples document they published earlier on in April. So let's move on and just have a look at what we're going to look at today. So basically, we're going to look at the 10% levy transfer information that's been put into the new funding rules. We're going to look at some clarification and changes that have been made to the 20% off the job rules and information. We're going to look at the subcontracting clarification and information that's been added in, the endpoint assessment clarifications, and also finally a few other changes and clarifications which have been added in to the funding rules. So first of all, 10% levy transfer. As you may know, from the 1st of April, the government introduced the opportunity for employers to be able to transfer 10% of their levy funds, obviously that only happens if they're a levy-paying employer, to another employer to support them delivering apprenticeships. Now that other employer can either be a non-levy-paying employer or it can be a levy-paying employer. So they can basically transfer to any other employer that they wish to. At this time, they're only allowed to transfer to one other employer. They're not allowed to transfer to a series of employers. That's really because the ESFA has decided they just want to test the process before they enable employers to transfer to more than one employer. So Employers might find different reasons for doing this. So, I mean, for instance, if you're a large employer with excess levy that you can't spend, and you've got a supply chain, and you want to improve the services or the products that you purchase from that supply chain for your own business, you may want to work with supply chain employers to get them to run apprenticeships that will hopefully improve the services you get or the products that you're buying from that particular supplier. Another reason for 10% levy transfer could be that groups of employers in a certain area of the country or a certain region may know of particular skills deficits that they've got in that region, or a particular area where they've got a lack of certain types of skills, and they may decide as groups of employers, for instance, if you've got a group of employers that are part of, say, a levy skills board, and they know, for example, that they are lacking in engineering skills in their area or in laboratory skills in their area, they may decide as a group of employers to not so much pool their levy, but work with other employers in the area that can run more apprenticeships that can address that particular skills need. So what you would get is more apprenticeships running in a region, delivering the particular skills that the group of employers in the region might need, which would then mean there would be a wider pool of apprentices or skilled workers with those types of skills to recruit from for all businesses in that region, which then again makes all businesses in that region more successful because they can easily recruit the skills that they need. So that would be another particular example of a good use of 10% transfer of levy funds. Now, even though the board was brought in on the 1st of April, transferred funds can only be used from the 1st of May. And also they can only be used for the delivery of apprenticeship standards, not apprenticeship frameworks. If an employer that you're working with, if you're a provider, is thinking about transferring their funds and then thinking about transferring to a non-levy employer, before that non-levy employer can receive the funds, they must be on the apprenticeship service. And even if they're a levy-paying employer but they haven't got an apprenticeship service account, they need to register before May or from May if they want to receive those transferred funds. And the first transfer payments will be made from June. So transferred funds can be used from the 1st of May, but no payments will be made to any employer receiving those funds until the 1st of June. So, providers who don't currently have a non-levy contract to deliver. So basically, with 10% levy transfer, as you all know, there was a procurement for delivery to non-levy paying employers last year. And quite a few providers who applied didn't actually get a levy-paying contract, a non-levy paying contract to deliver to non-levy paying employers from the ESFA. But under the new transfer arrangements, a provider that doesn't have a non-levy contract will be able to deliver to the 10% receiving employers. So there's an opportunity there for any providers that missed out on that contract to potentially work with some non-levy paying employers in their area. As I've made clear in the point there, obviously if you're a small employer and you're of less than 50 staff and you're delivering to a 16 to 18-year-old apprentice, those apprenticeships still remain fully funded by the government, so the transfer arrangement could not apply to that type of apprentice in that type of employer. There's the third point there also addresses the state aid, so any employers that receive state aid must make sure they don't go over that €200 allowed limits, and that's the state aid rules. And the highlighted state aid pink writing in point 3 is a link to the state aid rules online. So if when you receive the slides, you'll be able to click on that and it'll take you straight to the hyperlink for the state aid rules, which are online. I've also provided more information for employers and providers that's on a page. It's an HTML page on the .gov server. Some of the information on that page is not actually in the funding rules. For example, the point about employers currently only being able to transfer 10% of their levy to one other employer is not written into the funding rules at the moment. It's only on the HTML page that's flagged on that link there in the bottom point. So do please, when you receive this set of slides, click on that and make sure that you're aware of what's in the HTML information online as well as what's in the funding rules, because both documents give information and some of it is not in one document and it is in the other. A little bit confusing, I know, but the government never make it easier putting all information in one place. So, on to the next bit. Off-the-job training clarifications. There's been some clarification and a few changes to the off-the-job aspect of the funding rules. The first thing I think the government has made very clear and has sort of upgraded the content and I suppose realistically tried to make it clearer to both providers and employers is that content inside an apprenticeship standard or framework must be teaching new knowledge, skills and behaviours. I'm presuming this is in response to a lot of the comments recently that have been out in the press and in the media about apprenticeships being rebadged from current employer training rather than being a real apprenticeship. And the reality is that an apprenticeship should be teaching new knowledge, skills and behaviours. And so they're wanting to make that very clear that it can't be just certificating content or training that the employer already does. The other thing that they've made clear is that any training and off the job must map to the standard. So we know that there have been employers that have been asking providers to include their own internal training in the apprenticeship training that they're delivering on behalf of that employer, but which you can do, but only if the training that the employer already runs maps to the standard. So if there's other training that the employer does to bring that individual employee up to the level where they know their job role completely to the employer's so the employer is content with their abilities and their employees' work. If that training doesn't map to the standard, it cannot be included and it can't be paid for by the levy. That's got to be done separately by the employer. So only skills, knowledge and behaviours that are directly relevant to the apprenticeship standard can count towards any off-the-job training and also to that apprenticeship in full. They've added in some information on payment of wages. Now this is that the employer can only pay the apprenticeship wage rate from the start of an apprenticeship programme and not from before. So if, for example, an employer has taken on an employee and they've been working for that employer for 6 months and the employer has known that that employee is going to do an apprenticeship, they can't pay the apprenticeship wage rate for that first 6 months. They've got to pay normal wages. So the apprenticeship rate only starts from the day one of the apprenticeship programme, not before. The final, one of the other bits is the clarification of the off-the-job. The 20% is the minimum expectation. Dependent on the apprenticeship, it may be that 20% of off-the-job training, that more than 20% off the training may be necessary. Now, this sort of pops up again when Ofsted look at apprenticeships when they're doing their Ofsted inspections. And Ofsted make it very clear in the Common Inspection Framework that they don't look at the 20%. They don't actually log that. They're not there to audit that 20% is being delivered. What Ofsted are there to audit or look at is whether the individual apprentice that the apprenticeship being delivered is of good quality. They will look at the learning journey of that individual apprentice, and as part of that learning journey, they will assess whether the off-the-job is doing what it should do, i.e. it's delivering the knowledge and the skills that the learner needs to be competent in their role and to achieve that apprenticeship at the end of the programme. So if Ofsted were to assess one of the apprenticeship programmes and feel that more than 20% was necessary for the delivery of that apprenticeship, and the provider had not delivered that more than 20%, then they're not going to be particularly pleased with your apprenticeship delivery, and you could find yourself getting a lower inspection grade than anticipated. So what the government is really trying to make clear here is that 20% is the minimum amount, and it's down to providers and employers to really assess the skills needs of that individual apprentice and the apprenticeship that's being delivered, and make sure that what is being delivered as off the job meets the need of the apprentice and that apprenticeship. And the 20% is really the minimum. We also know that realistically 20% is not going anywhere. The Minister made it very clear at a recent webinar that she ran, and also it was made very clear at the annual apprenticeship conference up in Birmingham recently that the 20% is here to stay. The government and the ESFA, DFE, the Minister see it as very much a very important aspect of our apprenticeships from the point of view of quality. And if you look at all the other European programmes, a minimum of 1 day off the job is what they all include to ensure that the learner is getting the skills and knowledge they need to be fully competent and to excel in their role when they've completed their programme. So I really can't see 20% going up anywhere, regardless of the fact that we know that in some cases it's applied in very strange ways. For example, I recently spoke to a provider who was working with 2 employers running the same apprenticeship in the same town. One of the employees worked 45-hour weeks, and the other employees worked a 37-hour week. So the employee that was working 45-hour week, unfortunately, the apprenticeship off-the-job calculation resulted in more off-the-job hours being needed for that particular apprentice than the apprentice that was working 37 hours a week. So we know that the 20% is a bit of a blanket approach. It's not perfect, but at the moment, it's the one that we've got to address the quality of apprenticeship and the quality of learning taking place in apprenticeship. So don't expect anything to change in the near future. Few other points that these are actual off-the-job changes rather than clarifications. So one of the things that's changed is that in the previous version of the apprenticeship funding rules, the off-the-job training was stated as taking place during paid hours and rather than paid working hours. So paid working hours now changed to paid hours. So how this changes the actual calculation of off-the-job means that previously some providers were calculating off-the-job training not including the holiday weeks that the apprentice was doing. And when it says paid working hours, it changed to paid hours. If the apprentice is having paid holiday, which as we know most of them will, then you now have to ensure that you are including the paid holiday in the calculation of your off-the-job. So if you look at the example on the right-hand side of the slide there, you can see that for a normal 8-hour day across a 5-day working week, that equals 40 hours. You now have to calculate that across 52 weeks rather than 47 or 48 weeks, which results in 416 hours off the job. That's the current calculation that you have to work to. Now, by paid hours, the ESFA does mean that the apprentice's normal contracting hours, so that doesn't include any periods of irregular overtime. But if, for example, an apprentice did regular overtime, so they were required to do 1 Saturday a week as part of their normal contract, and that 1 Saturday a week was written into their contract and was paid as overtime, as the provider, you would need to make sure that that regular overtime was included in the off-the-job calculation. So, if they worked on Saturdays or if they work a 6-day week, that does mean that the off-the-job hours are going to be more than someone who works a 5-day week with no overtime, or someone who just works a bog standard 5-day week. So regular overtime that is an expected aspect of a job role, that needs to be taken into account and added into the off-the-job calculation. So let's take a little bit closer look at the subcontracting changes. This particular document, I put a link there at the bottom of the slide to this document, gives some policy and background examples for subcontractors. I think what the ESFA are trying to do here is make it very clear that the apprenticeship levy and the government funds that are used to fund apprenticeships are not diverted away from the actual training and delivery of apprenticeships in the form of fees or subcontracting top slices and other charges for subcontracting. So what the government is looking for is value for money. And they've made this very clear in this example policy document. They're making it much clearer in the funding rules with some increased rigorousness of what they've included in the new funding rules. What they've also said is that they're also going to review some of the apprenticeship subcontracting funding rules before August of this year. So as I said earlier, I think we can expect some further changes or further clarifications or further rules in the new funding rules for 2018-19. So this particular document offers advice and examples to demonstrate the rules requiring lead providers to deliver on programme. One thing that it does talk about a little bit is that question of substance, which has come up again and again and again in subcontracting arrangements. And what the ESFA have said here, because I think we've asked them, and I know that AELP colleagues have asked them, and other specialist colleagues have asked about what some substance may mean when it comes to subcontracting. And the ESFA has basically said they do not want to define or quantify substance in absolute terms. Now, what they've said is, because they think that over a period of time, the employer's apprenticeship programme may well evolve, and also it is to a certain extent going to be down to what employers need within their apprenticeship programme that should dictate whether apprenticeship subcontracting is taking place. So if, for an example, you were a care provider and you're working with a care employer, and the care employer wanted to deliver the clinical aspect of that particular apprenticeship, and the provider was delivering the rest of the apprenticeship, that would be totally acceptable, even though that clinical aspect of the apprenticeship may only be 5 or 10% of the apprenticeship. That's absolutely fine. What the subcontracting rules have made very clear is that when you negotiate that arrangement with the employer, that the provider, if the provider is paying some of the costs of that clinical delivery to the employer, it can only be paid as actual cost of delivery. So all you would be able to pay the employer would be the cost of their delivery, which would be the person who was doing the training, potentially the cost for the room that the training was taking place in, and any other cost which might apply to the delivery. You cannot pay any more than the actual costs to the employer. The other thing which I think with regards to defining substance that the ESFA has done here is they basically said that if the employer comes to you and says, okay, we've got a provider over here that we work with, they only deliver this type of apprenticeship and we only want 2 of them this year, but you are a main provider and you're going to be delivering the bulk of them, then that's absolutely fine as well, because it's what the employer wants. So the small provider may only deliver 2, and as a main provider you may deliver the bulk of them. Bulk of the rest of the apprenticeships, that could be another 20 or 25 or 30 apprenticeships. But also it could well be, for example, that if you are a main provider and you're actually only delivering a very small part of the apprenticeships, but there's a specialist aspect, and in that particular year the employer has said, actually we want 25 of these specialist delivery over here, but we've only got it comes from a specialist provider, and they've only got either a supporting or a small provider contract to deliver, that you as the main prime provider may only be delivering 1 or 2, or you may be delivering the English and maths or just the business administration aspect of that apprenticeship. If it's what the employer wants, and you as the prime provider have that in writing from the employer, and that's been defined as what the employer means, then I think you would be absolutely fine. The ESFA doesn't expect that the auditors are going to determine any compliance against that sort of that qualification of what substance means. It's really about delivering what the employer wants. And what the ESFA will be looking for very carefully, I think, is that prime providers are not making money or creaming off profit, potentially, from fees and charges that you might make to any of the subcontractors that are delivering on your behalf. So realistically, the whole subcontracting issue is around the value for money that the public purse is getting from the delivery of the apprenticeships, and the value for money that the employer is getting from the delivery of the apprenticeships in terms of knowledge, skills, behaviours, and increased expertise of their own staff. So, endpoint assessment clarification. Now this is very interesting, this new development, these clarifications inside the funding rules. Basically, it's now stated there's a new line inside the funding rules that states that endpoint assessment organisations are not delivery subcontractors. And I think there may have been, potentially, some providers that treating EPA organisations as subcontractors. There may have been the suggestion that subcontractors those EPA organisations should pay fees to the prime provider. I'm not quite sure, but that's a strange rule to put in. But basically, they're making it very clear that EPA organisations are not delivery subcontractors, that they are a delivery organisation in their own right as the deliverer of the endpoint assessment of that particular apprenticeship. It was in the funding rules before, but it's been clarified and made more obvious that there is a need for endpoint assessment organisations to have access to some of the information around individual apprentices to ensure that endpoint assessment organisations can claim certification and enable the endpoint assessment to occur. So they've made it very clear that this arrangement has now got to be in the written agreement that actually you will share apprentices' relevant ILR information with the endpoint assessment organisation. So that has to be done upfront to make sure that the provider is willing to share and aware that they have to share that information to enable EPA to occur. So if that's not currently in your written agreement, you need to start thinking about what additional content you're going to put in that document to make sure that you can do that. The other thing that's also happened is with EPA clarification is the confirmation about the duration of the apprenticeship, and when and what should be put into the ILR to include this. Now, it used to be, I think, that basically an apprenticeship, if it's a 12-month apprenticeship, that the actual delivery of on programme or the actual delivery of the apprenticeship had to be at least 366 days. But what the ESFA have now made very clear is that the delivery of apprenticeship, the on-programme, the learning content of that apprenticeship, that is the actual 12 months delivery. And the endpoint assessment cannot be included in that 12 months delivery. Endpoint assessment comes after, if you're doing a 12-month apprenticeship, that 12 months delivery of on-programme learning and content. So what they've put in is the minimum amount should be 372 days. I'm presuming that's because the ESFA is assuming that EPA occurs in the last week or in that extra week after the end of the actual delivery of on-programme. That's an interesting one because obviously endpoint assessment organisations, dependent on when the provider is actually booking, have to have time to pull those resources together and make sure that we've got endpoint assessors that are available for the provider to actually have the EPA occur when they want. So what I'd say to all providers out there is if you've got apprenticeships going on at the moment and you haven't started thinking about when your EPA needs to take place, please don't leave it till the last minute. Endpoint assessment organisations do need time to ensure that the resource is available, the endpoint assessor is available, and that you will get the date and time that you would actually like for the delivery of that endpoint assessment for your individual apprentices or your groups of apprentices. Don't leave it till the last minute. The sooner you book it, and we know obviously you have to balance that against assessing how well your apprentices are doing, whether they're actually going to be ready for on-programme at the time that you thought, but nonetheless having as much time as possible with the booking gives the endpoint assessment organisation far better scope for ensuring that you can get the time and date for EPA that you want the further ahead that you book it. It also states that the endpoint assessment cost is negotiated between the employer and the EPA organisation, and they state that the provider should play no role in this negotiation. Now, this is in the funding rules, so it is actually a rule that the provider should play no role in the negotiation of the cost of EPA between the EPA organisation and the employer. I'm not really sure how this is going to work because we all know that many employers out there have asked their provider to do this work for them as a close partner, and it is the provider that's having that negotiation and those conversations with the endpoint assessment organisation. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch because as that's now a rule, realistically everybody should be adhering to that rule. But I'm not sure that it's really going to work in realistic terms, actually out in the landscape where you're all working and we're all working. So it'll be interesting to see how that works. I'm presuming this is in preparation for the changes that are going to occur next year, where in actual fact payment for endpoint assessment will no longer come from the provider, but it will come from the employer's apprenticeship service direct to the endpoint assessment organisation, and that change is due to occur next year. And the final EPA clarification there is that there is no longer any need for further learning in order to retake a mandatory qualification or the endpoint assessment. It used, and this is an actual change rather than a clarification, because it used to be that if cost of retakes or resits was going to come out of the levy, then further learning had to take place. But that has now changed and it can be funded from the levy regardless of whether further learning has taken place. I did ask the ESFA whether that also applied to an apprentice that might want to take a resit to improve their grade. I didn't really get an answer to that question, so I'm assuming what they basically said was we think we've made the clarification clear. So they haven't mentioned anything about retakes of an apprenticeship to improve grade, so I'm assuming that what they've said is that to retake a mandatory qualification or retake endpoint assessment, that improving a grade as part of that is now included, and that can also be funded from the levy because they won't clarify that directly. So if anybody at the ESFA is aware that that's different, it would be good if they could flag it to us and to the providers. So, a few final points of clarification and change. One of the things that I'm sure I can hear a lot of providers now cheering about is the fact that there is no longer a need to get a signature from a parental guardian in the written agreement if you've got 16 or 17-year-old apprentices. And I know this has been a real pain for a lot of providers to be chasing up and down the country trying to get a signature from a parental guardian before they can start off their 16 to 18 apprentice. So you no longer have to do this. So go out and get yourself a bottle of bubbly and cheer about that one. There's also been a new paragraph inserted to take account of the new data protection and GDPR rules. These are the new privacy rules which are coming into play on the 1st of May, so it's worth making sure that you are aware of them. Obviously that's going to apply to data protection when it comes to working with endpoint assessment organisations, so it's just as well to be aware of that in preparation, because obviously you've got to put that into your written agreement, so you'll need to make sure that the legalities of that are clear. Again, this is the ESFA and DFE and the government making sure they're making it very clear that employers do not profit from the apprenticeship delivery to their own apprentices in any way. That's in funding terms rather than return on investment. So they've added in an additional paragraph stating that there must be no offsetting of any service provided to the employer against apprenticeship costs, and that employers do not profit from the apprenticeship delivery. So they're making it very clear that there can't be any payment in kind, and that if employers are delivering part of the apprenticeship, they cannot receive anything other than actual delivery costs. And that's obviously, that's in 2 or 3 sentences in the updated version of the funding rules, so they're making that very clear now. There is inclusion of a greatly expanded section on the accepted English and Maths for learners with special needs, and this is a real bonus for any providers out there that are working with learners with special needs in apprenticeships. It basically widens the exemptions for this group to include entry through functional skills as an outcome, and at the end of the new funding rules, they've added in an additional annex which lists all the approved Maths and English qualifications, and that includes the entry through functional skills as part of that outcome for the LLDD. So that's a real bonus for those of you that are working, because that's been very difficult for some of the learners that are probably never going to actually reach that level of English and Maths. And just finally, what can we expect to see during 2018-19? Well, as I said earlier, the Minister says that we can't expect any change to 20% off the job arrangements. That's here to stay. One thing the Minister did say is that the levy will stay, but the Department for Education are open to discussions to how to make it easier to deliver, particularly for non-levy and SMEs. Well, that 10% transfer amount, that's the beginning of that pathway. I think what DFE will be doing is, the Department for Education and ESFA and the Minister will be doing, is looking at how the 10% transfer works and whether it does encourage more delivery of apprenticeships inside the smaller organisations out there. If it doesn't, then maybe we can expect some further changes during 2018-2019 to enable SMEs to deliver apprenticeships and be happier to deliver apprenticeships and get involved in the landscape. Institute of Apprenticeships have announced an improved trailblazer process, the Faster and Better programme, and indeed they have actually recently published on Citizen Space a whole list of new apprenticeship trailblazers which are now out there, apprenticeship standard trailblazers, which are out there for consultation for any employer that's not involved in the trailblazer to look at the content of those particular standards, to see whether they're happy with the content, if it's an apprenticeship that they might be thinking about delivering sometime in the next year. I think there was at least another 70 or 80 apprenticeship standards published for consultation. So do go to Citizen Space and have a look at those if you're interested. They've also announced that they expect there should be, by the end of next year, somewhere in the region, I think it was about 700 or 800 apprenticeship standards available for delivery. So they are really working very hard to improve the number of apprenticeship standards that are going to be available over the next couple of years. And as I said earlier, we expect changes to the apprenticeship funding bands, potentially more funding bands. That's all about that value for money, and making sure that apprenticeships being delivered are actually being delivered for costs that reflect the actual real cost of delivery. We can expect more standards with mandatory qualifications, because the IFA has eased up on the rules for including a mandatory qualification within an apprenticeship standard. What they basically said is it can't reflect the EPA requirements, but if it reflects the on-programme content of the standard, a mandatory qualification can be included. And finally, we know that the ESFA are looking at audit of 20% off the job. They're also looking at the pricing structure versus eligible costs of apprenticeships when they're coming in and doing audit. And that Ofsted apprenticeship inspection ratings will look at the 20% off the job in terms of quality and quantity, but not in terms of whether you're actually hitting the 20%, but whether you're providing a quality learning pathway for the individual apprentice and the outcome of that. So that's what we can expect during 2018-19 and the things that you should be looking for in readiness. And I think that is about it for today, ladies and gentlemen, so I hope that was helpful. And now we are happy to take any questions that you might have.
So if you've got any questions you'd like Bryony to answer, please can you type them into the question tab and we'll answer them for you in just a minute.
Hi everybody. Okay, so we've got some questions that have come up. The first one that's come up is, hi Bryony, please can you confirm that the webinar relates only to apprenticeships funding in England? Yes, Karen, it does. It's just England, not Wales and Scotland, because obviously they've got very different arrangements for their apprenticeship delivery. Peter from the North Tyneside, can you tell me if an 18-month standard is, this to reach the gateway, or is it completion of the EPA? No, Peter, that's that bit I covered earlier. If there's an 18-month standard, the 18 months is for the on-programme delivery. Endpoint assessment has to come after that. So when it talks about the duration of an apprenticeship standard or apprenticeship framework, it is all about the on-programme delivery of that apprenticeship. Endpoint assessment has to come after the end of that duration. I hope that's clear. However, that may mean possibly some centres may listen to this webinar and then at the end realise it doesn't apply to them. Sorry to be a pain. Oh, sorry, Karen. I should have made clear. Yes, so it is the apprenticeship changes were the English apprenticeship funding changes. I don't think either Scotland or Wales has actually published any changes to their funding of apprenticeships. So I'm sorry, we did actually assume that everyone would know it was about the English apprenticeship funding rules.
And also moving forward, we'll make sure to put England into the titles of the webinars just so we don't have any mix up in future.
Sorry, everybody. Will a market in traded 10 transfers develop? Oh, will the transfer seek to recover the 10% through normal trading prices? John, to be absolutely honest, I'm really not sure exactly what you mean by that, so apologies. I mean, you can't trade the 10% transfers. Basically, you can only agree to pay it to one particular employer. That employer has to use that 10% transfer just for the delivery of apprenticeships. The employer that's transferring money has to agree with the receiving employer exactly what apprenticeships are going to be delivered with that money up front. That has to be written into an agreement and a contract, and the money has to be used for the delivery of those apprenticeships and those apprenticeships only. And the money cannot be transferred back. So once that receiving employer has received the 10% or however much is being delivered, they just have to use it for the delivery of the apprenticeship that's been agreed. They can't use it for anything else, and they can't move it on to another employer or transfer it back to the previous employer. It has to be used up. So I don't think that sort of market in traded 10% transfers will really develop, because the ESFA have put in some pretty strict rules about what can and can't be done, and you'll find them on those links that I included in the slides. So as an employer provider, does the Levy transfer rules provide us with an opportunity to deliver apprenticeships as the employer we choose to transfer to? For example, we transfer to an employer in our supply chain, but deliver the apprenticeships to their staff and recoup the money as payment for the training. No, I'm afraid it doesn't allow you to do that, because as an employer provider, you can only deliver to your own staff. So you couldn't actually deliver to another employer in your supply chain. You would have to find a provider to do that. Also, in the same way, for example, because providers, for instance, large apprenticeship providers and FE colleges in their own right sometimes are levy payers, they cannot transfer any of their funds to another employer and then deliver that apprenticeship. There is a line in the apprenticeship funding rules that states that providers cannot do that. So a provider can't transfer some of their money to an employer and then deliver that apprenticeship. They're not allowed to do that either. So no. You can't, as an employer provider, you can't deliver to your supply chain. You can only deliver to your own staff. When transferring 10% funds to another employer, do the apprentices this will be used for show on our account? Hi, Michael Lomas. No, the apprentices that are being delivered to will show on the receiving employer's account, because they will have to set that up on the apprenticeship service. And the provider will claim that in the normal way via their ILR, but it will show on the receiving employer apprenticeship service account rather than your account. Although the transfer of funds will show in your account, you'll see where the money has been transferred out, and then it will appear in the account of the company that you've transferred it to. But this is you'll need to set up sort of proper legal contracts with regard to that. I believe, if I'm right in saying, the ESFA is going to be providing paperwork for that. So expect that in the very near future. Elizabeth, I think you lost audio. I'm very sorry. I hope you did get it back. If not, please do look for the recording and the slides and the Q&A, which should be up on the website in the next 24 hours.
I'll also email it to you after as well.
Okay. Is there a template for the agreement between EPAO and the training provider? Hello, John. Endpoint assessment organisations do have their own agreements for working with training providers or working with employers. So best to ask your individual endpoint assessment organisation. We all have our own terms and conditions because obviously City and Guilds is an endpoint assessment organisation for some of the apprenticeship standards. So yes, we do. There isn't a template, but most EPAOs are putting in place their own agreements. It may be that next year, when the ESFA makes the change on the apprenticeship system, that employers will be paying endpoint assessment organisations directly, that they put in place some sort of agreement that we need to adhere to. I have asked the ESFA about this, and they have said that they will be putting rules in place for the transfer of endpoint assessment funding to EPAOs from the apprenticeship service. So I think we can expect something then, but in the interim, no, there isn't. You'll just need to work directly with your endpoint assessment organisation. Andrew Kirk, I'm sorry, I can't read that. I haven't got my glasses, everybody, and it's quite small writing. So Andrew Keel, I think it says. Just to confirm, please, say a carpentry apprentice is working with a general builder and is being shown groundworking, brickworks, etc., that this cannot be used as off-the-job training. I think it depends on what's in the content of the apprenticeship standard that you're delivering, Andrew. If the apprenticeship standard lists groundworking or brickwork in the standard, then yes, but if it's not in the standard, then no, because I mean a carpentry apprentice, I would think, would not normally get to know about brickwork and groundworking, maybe groundworking, but no, if it's not written into the standard, it can't be included as off the job. It has to map to the standard and the content of the standard. Sound is problematic on this webinar. Sounds like your presenter is in a bathroom. Oh, sorry everybody. EAPs have set their prices, so where is the negotiation anyway? Okay, Karen, I understand what you're saying, that some EAPs have set their costs, but much like everybody else, we have to make sure that we cover our costs. We have to cover the cost of the endpoint assessor. In most cases, those people are individuals who are working on a consultancy basis. Some of them have day rates that we have to cover, that cover the cost of their expertise. So in some cases, yes, we may well have set rates. Most endpoint assessment organisations may well be willing to negotiate if there's more than one apprentice. Most of us have set our rates, or most EPAs, I think, have set rates based on one apprentice. So it's still down to you to have that conversation and see if there is any opening for negotiation. Please clarify the minimum amount of time on programme for a 12-month apprenticeship. Is the EPA after day 365? Hello, Liz Pater. Yes, it is. As I said earlier on, the actual on-programme content is the duration of apprenticeship. EPA has to take place after that. And then Gordon Richardson, providing learner information to EPAO. Is this GDPR compliant? My assumption is that we should have this agreement with the learner as part of the learner agreement. I would think so, Gordon, yes. I'm actually about to do some training myself on the GDPR, so I can understand it. Potentially, maybe should have done that before the webinar, but the webinar is more about the funding rules than the GDPR. So, yes, check your GDPR and see what you have to do to enable you to share that information with your endpoint assessment organisation. And endpoint assessment organisations will be doing the same at this end as well. Trudy Ford, is it correct that where minimum learning is 372 days and the EPA is to be done in the gap between 365 and 372 days? Yes. So yeah, let me just clarify. Where the duration of apprenticeship is listed in the standard as either 12 months, 18 months, 24 months, 3 years, whatever it is, that is the actual on-programme delivery. Any endpoint assessment has to take place after the on-programme delivery, and on-programme delivery is the duration. Karen, also employers are not going to be registered with e.g. City and Guilds and therefore won't be able to register for and get the endpoint assessment support. Are you going to change your systems? We're going to have to, Karen. Yes, we will. That's something that we'll be working towards in preparation for next year. So how does endpoint assessment then apply for longer duration standards? It depends on the duration. So, I mean, truly, if it was a 2-year, then you'd be going for 2 times 365 days, plus whatever time you've got to book the EPA afterwards. So I hope I've made that clear now, that the duration of the apprenticeship is for the on-programme, and then you obviously need more time afterwards to book for the EPA. And the sooner you book your endpoint assessment with your endpoint assessment organisation, the more likely you are to get the dates you want. so that EPA has got time to book endpoint assessors, make sure resources are ready, and make sure that they've got things like places to run the endpoint assessment for an assessment centre or premises, whatever's needed. Is there a template for the agreement? I think we've answered that one. When calculating 20% off the job, is the time taken to complete endpoint assessment? No. No, off the job is not part of endpoint assessment, Alan. It's just part of on programme. So your 20% off the job must have been completed by the time you get to the end of the duration. So if you've got a 12-month, if you saw the calculation earlier on in the slide, you've got a 12-month duration apprenticeship. Your 20%, 416 hours, must have been completed by the end of that 12 months. EPA is completely separate from any off the job. Is there any suggestion, recommendation where to include a statement regarding sharing the ILR data with the endpoint assessment organisation? Hello, Peter. No, there isn't. I think you need to have a look at the GDPR rules in the same way that endpoint assessment organisations will be, and then it needs to be put in your own written agreement, and nobody's supplied any sort of template or recommendation for that so far. So it's something you need to work with a legal team on and make sure that you're with your team that understands the privacy rules under the new GDPR, and then make sure that you're adhering to them. I've got a question from Vicky. Do these changes apply only to apprenticeships enrolled from a particular date? It applies to apprentices enrolling from the 1st of April. So the new rules apply from 1st of April to 31st of July. So any apprentices that were enrolled before the 1st of April, the new rules do not apply to. And we've got another question from Peter. And does the provider need to explain which details they'll be shared with the EPA? Yes, I think in your written statement and your written agreement with the EPA, yes, you would need to do that, Peter. We are now, I'm afraid, coming to the end of the webinar. So I'll answer a couple more questions and then I'm afraid we'll have to finish. And then we will make sure that the Q&A is up on the site by the end of this week. So you'll be able to get answers to any questions that we haven't managed to fit in today. We've got an awful lot of questions still to get to, everybody. I can't think how many there is here, but there's an awful lot of them. So I will try and make sure I spend the next 24 hours answering as many of them as possible. Let's just see. Hi, is there an additional, so this is from Tanya Fairs. Hi, Bridie, is there an additional charge to the employer apprenticeship training provider for retakes of endpoint assessment? Tanya, it really depends what you negotiate as part of your initial pricing with the employer. If you negotiate in the amount for an amount for potential retakes or resits, then obviously, yes, it can come out of that negotiated amount, and it can come out of the levy. So that's really down to what you negotiate with the employer up front before you start actually delivering that apprenticeship. But now, if there is a resit or a retake, it can come out of the levy costs. So, and also, obviously, you'll need to sit down with the EPA and work out, what their cost is, what they would charge you for a retake, and then include that in the negotiation with the employer. Can preparation for endpoint assessment count towards the 20% practice interviews, etc.? Oh, Teresa, hi, I hope you're well. That's a very good question. Can preparation for endpoint assessment count towards 20% practice interviews, etc.? I'll tell you what, Teresa, I will double check that and I will come back to you. I'm presuming, obviously, that's a very good question, not one I think we thought about. So yeah, I will check that and come back to you and try and answer that by the Q&A. I don't think we can actually fit any more questions in this morning because we've already gone over time. So thank you, everybody. Please do look for the Q&A up on the website in the next 24, 48 hours. It might actually be 48 hours because I've got so many questions to answer here. I think it's going to take me most of the day and tomorrow to actually get it done, and then we'll have to check it. So you might want to look at more Friday for that to get up on the website rather than tomorrow, because it's going to take me a while. So thank you, everybody. I hope that was useful, and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.